Hello and welcome to another edition of the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show, where this week we're super happy to have the athletic director at Arcadia High School, Mr. Drew Ammon, on the show. Coach is joining us, and this is the second episode in a series that I've been pretty excited about doing for coaches there. Like I said, the number one goal that we have as a show is to try to give a free resource to coaches out there that they can broaden their knowledge base. We've had a ton of coaches offer up that you saw during the season, offer up their scheme stuff and different things. We've talked about culture building, and we thought, what better way to help coaches? And as we approach this next coaching cycle, because as the season ends, that coaching carousel seems to get going, what better resource to have for coaches out there for them to see real live ADs talk about things that can help you set yourself apart in that interview selection process, the interview itself, what you can do to better your program, get a jump start on it, and all those type of things. So want to make sure we talk about all that, and we will definitely have time for that. But before I do that, just want to make sure I take a moment to remind everybody that the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show is brought to you by School Funder. School Funder, the only online fundraising company in America that lets you keep all of the money your team raises. Sounds too good to be true. I can tell you firsthand that it is true. We've used School Funder 2 years in a row for our lift-a-thon and kept all of that money minus the small 3% processing fee, which my understanding goes on every credit card interaction. So School Funder did a great job for us. I encourage you to contact them. Really, really easy to work with coaches out there. I know fundraising is not always our big thing, but it's hugely necessary in this competitive world of high school athletics. So please contact School Funder. That's SCHOOLFUNDR.org, and let them know that the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show sent you, as it'll help the show. And while you're helping the show, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. Please, it is absolutely free. We are doing this just specifically to have a resource out there. We'll never charge anything for coaches to have and be able to gain knowledge. And the more subscriptions we have, the more coaches that we can reach. So that's the reasoning behind that. So please, like I said, I have a ton of coaching podcasts that I follow and subscribe to. Just click it and you're done. Not going to cost you a penny, and you'll get updates on all our newest episodes and things like that. We'll always have at least one episode a week for you to dive into and hopefully gain some knowledge that'll help you and your football program. All right, so we're going to get right into the topic at hand. A lot to cover. This has been a subject that I really enjoyed. Really enjoyed talking to Mr. David Kleck at Mesa High. Super excited to talk to you today, Coach. But before we get into some of the details about the interview process, ADs, football coach relationship, getting the job, all those things, tell us a little bit about your football story.
Yeah, so I was, I think ingrained in it. I grew up in kind of all over the place. I like to say I was a military brat without the military. Moved from Southern California to a small town in Oklahoma called Poto, and that was kind of my first experience with football and just fell in love with it, right? And was blessed to have some great coaches along the way, notably Michael Spencer, who's the head football coach out at Astoria Foothill, was both my freshman and sophomore head coach, and then he was our offensive coordinator. And he really ingrained in me what I think all of us as coaches really want, being really good men, right? Growing up and being that. So played high school football, right? Wasn't really the biggest, wasn't necessarily the fastest. So went off, got my teaching credentials from NAU, and wanted to be a coach before I was a teacher, right? Like I think a lot of us, we wanted to get into the coaching profession. So luckily I was blessed to get my first coaching job with Max Ragsdale down at Campo Verde when they were opening up the school. And he really, again, another great mentor, that just kind of, inspired me to want to push further. And then got my first teaching job out at Combs High School. You're familiar with that part of the valley, right? Just north of Poston Butte. And worked there for 4 years with Jesse Hart, who now is the head coach at Mesquite High School. And he really helped me grow as a coach. I was the JV head coach there, became the defensive coordinator there. And then moved over to Tempe High, where I was defensive coordinator, co-defensive coordinator there with Brian Walker, who, again, great mentor, right? Those people that you could call on and just, you know, shoot questions to them and, hey, how would you handle this? How would you handle that? Spent a lot of nights in the meeting room, just talking about life, talking about kids. And really, those 4 years at Tempe High that I had were just some of the best because it really pushed me to understand kids, right? Working in that kind of environment. That's when I got my master's degree to be a high school administrator, and really wanted to kind of learn a little bit more. So was lucky enough to get a job out at Eastmark High School and was able to work with, in my opinion, one of the best athletic directors in the state, Craig Luschner. Learned a little bit from him, and well, not a little bit, still learning a lot of bit from him. And then got my first athletic director job up at Cactus Shadows in Cave Creek, where, that community loves their sports, loves their school, all those different things. So was there for a few years, and then I live in Queen Creek, so the drive from Cave Creek to Queen Creek was wearing on my family. I think a lot of us go into coaching and realize that our families take a hit a lot of times, and an opportunity to work in a really great school like Arcadia presented itself. And again, having the right support system, my principal at Cave Creek at Cactus Shadows encouraged me. She knew kind of my family was going through, and she encouraged me to apply for it. And I was lucky enough. I was blessed to get the job at Arcadia, and I'm really excited to still be there. And that community is kind of one in a million, I'll say.
Well, I will tell you what, you've certainly worked with some great mentors. Max Ragsdale, know Coach very well, coached against him for many years, back when he was at our Apache Junction High School.
Yeah.
And he used to run 7-on-7s out there. Very familiar with Brian Walker. Excellent leader of men. I've heard nothing but good things about Coach Hart. Tons of guys that you've worked for that are really, I'm not familiar with the Eastmark AD, but obviously you've had a lot of great mentors that have kind of helped you and paved your way a little bit, or helped you learn along the way. So that's always exciting, and I always like coaches getting the opportunity to talk about those guys that have made a positive impact on them. Also appreciate you talking a little bit about the AD life is tough. I see so much. Our AD is always here so often. She's a little bit fortunate. Her house is down the street, but you were talking about that's a 30, 40-minute drive every day, not to mention the fact that you're already at the school so often as an AD that your families do take a bit of a hit. So I always have great respect for the work that our ADs do. The good ones are incredible. So getting into the topic at hand, what the coaches want to hear about is, what do you think a coach can do in the interview selection process that's going to separate them and give them the ability to get the interview? I have been fortunate. I've been at Prescott. This will be my 12th year as the head coach, so I've been here a long time, and I've gotten to be on a few committees, both for our trainer, our baseball coach, and a couple other positions here. So I know a little bit about that. And the last one that I was a part of, I'm really fortunate that I'm somewhere that I don't plan on leaving, because I don't think my resume would get screened anymore, because very old school, look, on just written out. I mean, I think there's some good stuff on there, but some of the resumes I saw were video and different things like that. So in that screening process, Coach Kleka talked about the importance of calling the AD and trying to get at least a phone call or get an idea of what they're looking for, get them on the phone or things like that. But what can the coach do to separate themselves in that kind of screening process?
Yeah, Dave over at Mesa is an amazing athletic director, and he kind of, you alluded to it, reaching out and making yourself identifiable early, that at least gets you, when you're going through that screening, because it's really hard, getting that piece of paper and really trying to figure out who that coach is or what they stand for and things like that. So you reaching out, email, phone call, goes a long way in just saying, how much you want the position, right? I think a lot of us that, become head coaches, there was other head coaches, athletic directors that have invested time in us, that have given us some, advice in like, hey, I think you can make that jump to the next level, right? That is the only reason, I'm in the seat that I'm in, is I had some really great leaders that poured into my bucket, that, convinced me, I guess, that I was ready for it. I'll also say, for me, what is really important is letting the people around you know that you're applying for these jobs, right? Because a lot of times when we get these resumes in and we're so well connected, right? Like I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day, right? Rod Holmes over at Post and Butte now. One of my best friends was a freshman coach over there who's now the AD at Apache Junction, right? Traston Yates.
Great guy.
Yeah, the coaching world is so small.
I hired Traston at Post and View when I got the job there in 2016. But yeah.
Yeah, right. So the coaching world, no matter what sport you're in, is so small. And a lot of times when, you send your resume and you apply for a job and, oh, you coached at this school where I know that football coach, it's inevitable that there's going to be some sort of communication with that, right? And letting those people know, like, hey, look, I'm applying for this job, because that goes a long way for me. When I reach out to these people, or people that I reach out to say, oh, I didn't even know he was applying. I'm a big believer in transparency. And I tell my head coaches, like, hey, I have no problem if you want to go have a different challenge or go for a bigger job or things like that. Because I think at one point we all want that, right? We want the challenge. We want something like that in our life. Just let me know, so when I get that phone call, I'm not completely caught off guard. So I would tell coaches that, make sure your references know that you're applying for these jobs, because I've called an AD and he's like, I didn't even know who that person, was applying, and he didn't even really remember who that person was. So, you got to make sure your references match up to the jobs you're applying for. So those are, things for me is, it just shows that level of preparedness, right? I think that's what all head coaches, need to have. I had a mentor of mine say, a head football coach, and you might know this because you not only probably teach at the school, but you deal with probably every kid that walks Prescott High School, be it in your PE class or your weight training class. You're another administrator on that campus. So the weight that you carry does a lot for the culture of your school. And that's for every football coach. And if you're not prepared in that manner, I don't know how you could be prepared to run a comprehensive high school football program.
That was one of the things we've heard is guys getting that training and running even the freshman level, because a lot of times the varsity coach is very involved with the freshmen, but as you know, when the season gets going, that can be difficult. So even having that level of experience organizationally and being a leader, I've talked about this. When I became a head coach, I was 31, and I could work with kids. That wasn't an issue, but I'd never been in charge of grown men. I'd never been kind of where the buck stopped, and some guys that were 40, 45, 50 years old, I'd never done that. So that was an adjustment for me. I think if you're a good head coach, you talked about it a little bit. I think that conversation from an assistant perspective is probably pretty easy, because if you're a good head coach and you're hiring good people, I think you want people that aspire to be head coaches and reach that next level. Maybe a little bit different if you're talking about a challenge or there's something you're not happy about, but it could be something like you were talking about. You had nothing but positive things to say about Cactus Shadows, but an hour and 15 minutes or whatever it is every single day that you're not with your family because you're driving in a car is a challenge. So I think honesty is always kind of the best policy in that regard, and being upfront with people and talking about those things. So appreciate that. This is the one where I love this one, because I've been in some interviews. I don't plan on being in any more, because I plan on being here till I'm done. But common interview questions, because most of the time you don't get into football stuff. It's how do you run a program? How do you deal with the booster club? How do you deal with parents? How do you manage your coaching staff? How do you deal with discipline? All those type of things. I have had a few interviews where we did get into specifics of football, but what are some common interview questions that coaches can expect and better be ready to answer? And lastly, and Coach Kleck had talked about this, And I was probably guilty of this when I was a young guy. You came in there with the 200-page folder that no one is going through that. If you hand it to them, every page could say hello, and they'd go, "Oh, it looks like he's organized." They're not going to go through it and read it, I promise. But talk about a little bit about those common interview questions.
Yeah, so I'll kind of address the pamphlet, right? Everybody comes in with their binder, right? The big thing for me is I don't look at it right then. I always kind of look at it after. And the big time I think coaches run into with that is they put that together and they don't know what it says in there, right? They've pulled these. I'm going to pull this, handbook from here, or I'm going to pull these discipline from here, and then you come across and ask that, hey, how do you hold kids accountable in your program? And they just start, firing off X, Y, and Z, and we're taking notes about that stuff, and then I go back and look through that binder. Well, he didn't say anything about discipline. He didn't say, this is the punishment for being late to practice, or, if he breaks this team rule. So again, it comes back to that. You're not prepared to answer or talk to the things that you say are your core values in that pamphlet or that binder, right? And those are things that are real quick for, and I was one of those young head coaches, right? I made that binder look so good. It was color printed, and it was 3-hole punch, and it was great. And then they would ask me the question, and I would just go off on a tangent. And, that just, again, shows like you're not ready for this, right? So I think we've all had those common interview questions, right? We want to know, one for me that I ask in every one of my interviews, regardless if it's football, baseball, basketball, is walk me through your practice plan. Walk me through how you develop a practice plan, be it in season or out of season, right? You know this being a longtime football coach. Your football practices change from week 1 to week 10 just because of, the amount of hits the kids have taken throughout the year, the weather changing, right? I want to see coaches know that their practice plans are going to have to adapt and modify throughout the season just because of the wear and tear, right? You could do a little bit more hitting at the beginning of a season opposed to, hey, man, we're in week 12, getting ready to go into the quarterfinals. I don't want my stud running back taking unnecessary hits. I don't want my quarterback to get a flyby in somebody and he pops his, shoulder or anything like that. So, that's a one for me that I always really ingrain in is talk to me about practice plans. And I make sure to have my athletic trainer in my interviews as well, because, she is really important to what we do in athletics. And just getting her feedback on, how does that help a student stay healthier, or how does the practice plan help a student stay healthy? Another one that we talk a lot about that is always about some sort of communication. How are you communicating to your kids? How are you communicating to the parents? How are you communicating to our community, right? Being a football coach is more than just being a football coach. It's being a representative of your school, representative of the community. How are you doing those things? Those are really important things to me, because I'm not at your practices. I'm not, in the meeting rooms with your coaches, and that just, having the standard of communication is important in today's world, just because at all times we're being listened to, even if we think we're not being listened to. And then another big, component for me is I ask a question about weight training. How are we going to get our kids stronger, not only during the season, but out of the season as well? So that question pops up in every one of my interviews. And it's not necessarily how are you, the coach, going to be the strength trainer, but how are you going to get the resources, to be, to make sure our kids are getting the best they possibly can. Because I don't expect every coach to be a, certified strength training coach, but there are plenty of them around that are, good, that can get in and work with our kids. So those are kind of 3 that I make sure to kind of pop up in every one. But I would, the big part is make sure that what you're saying is consistent to if you do present the committee with some sort of documentation, right?
Love all that information, Coach. One of the important things, and this is me kind of spitballing from a coaching perspective, because I understand the ADs have a tough job. They get all, because nobody goes to the coach anymore. They go immediately to the AD if there's an issue, always. And sometimes they don't even go to you. They try to go above you and so forth and so on. So I fully can relate to you and how difficult your job is. But my question would be, and I'm trying to think of how to word this for coaches, because coaches, you got to understand the ADs have a difficult job, but you also got to understand that the ADs got to have your back as long as you're not doing anything that puts the head coach, puts any of those kids in danger safety wise. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, the AD should deflect a lot of those. Now, if you're doing something safety, that's a big issue right away. But if you're not, that guy knows you're a good quality person, and you're having a parent meeting every time Johnny's son didn't play as many snaps as you want, that's an issue from the coach's perspective, in my opinion. So how does a coach go about bringing that up before he has the job? How does he talk about that in a way that doesn't turn the committee off?
Yeah, and you know that's a great point, and I think a lot of your good athletic directors will understand that as soon as a parent emails me or emails my principal, it doesn't mean that the coach has done something wrong, right? Like that's where, you know, I think you said it earlier, right? Is the relationship between athletic director and coach. I try to talk to, you know, my head football coach and our coaches as often as I can. Me and my football coach have a standing meeting on Mondays where we talk, right? It could be about whatever we want it to. Sometimes it has nothing to do with football. It's just, you know, building that relationship with your coaches and showing them like, hey, when I get these emails, like, yeah, I'm going to ask you about it. And a lot of times it just is you know, give me the perspective, and then it's hey, you need to talk to the head coach, right? But in those interviews, how do you, you know, having that system of like, you know, when I think of good communication, I think it's weekly snapshots to your community, just of like, hey, you know, good week of practice. We had this, you know, maybe this standout practice player. This is the schedule for the week, right? Freshmen are playing at Camelback. JV's home against Camelback. We're at Camelback. You know, those type of just kind of snippets, right? You know, just giving those parents because that's really, I think, what drives a lot of this is parents don't know, right? What's going on. And, you know, how you kind of, what I always refer to it, taking ammo out of the gun. I tell coaches, right, that we can't give our community the ammunition to kind of put us up against. And that it's that being consistent in that communication. And that's how I would, you know, tell a coach like, hey, have that system of communication. I want your player to come in and talk to me, because that's, you know, that we're creating these young men to be advocates for themselves. Unfortunately, in today, we hear all these things about parents going to interviews with their kids out of college and things like that. Like, no, that's not teaching our kids how to be advocates for themselves. It always starts there. And luckily in Scottsdale Unified School District, we actually have that parent concern kind of flow chart, and it starts with the kid. And I make sure to address that at all my parent meetings. I think that kind of helps take some of that cover from your coaches of like, look, I'm telling parents this. And then I got to reiterate, right? Like, hey, have you talked to the coach yet? You haven't talked to the coach. You need to go have a conversation with the coach before we talk. You know, and the word that I hear a lot is retaliation in the role, but you know, I don't think people work for pennies on the dollar to punish kids, right? Like I think anybody who's working in high school as a coach is doing the right thing, you know. So I would say, you know, just having that flow chart, or having just, you know, I'm open to hearing from parents, but it has to be done, you know, 24 hours after a game. It needs to be addressed in an email first. I'm not going to get, you know, after either a win or a loss, right? After a big win, you're excited, you're jumping and hollering, and you know, parents could take that the wrong way too. You know, the perspective is all about who has it. And you know, I would say in the interview, that's how you go about it is, you know, I'm open to parent communication 24 hours after the game or after practice. You know, I will only talk to you if your kid is there. I love those type of things because, a lot of times I'm not going to say something to the kid that I wouldn't say to the parent, you know. So I think if you just having those things in your interview and just being confident in those, I don't think that turns off committees. I think that kind of gets them more to lean in a little bit, be like, oh, okay, these are good things.
Okay, good stuff to hear there. That is the one that I hear a lot from people, parents, because if you have a complaint and you're talking about the coach and somebody says something, so many times the parents, I don't want them to know because they'll take it against my kid. That just doesn't. I have not seen that happen in 25 years as a coach. But I do think if there's an issue, you have to at least be able to know who it's with, what's happened, or anything like that. So I think that's interesting you bring that up because that's something that I think coaches have definitely dealt with. You talked about being a baseball coach, and this is something that I think how important it is for the coach because you have to have a philosophy. My philosophy, our quarterback last year was best basketball. I think he's the best basketball player in the state, or at least in the top 3 or 4. He was pretty special. But I think you have to have that. I love multi-sport guys. We always encouraged our guys to wrestle. We wanted them, but whatever they were able, whatever team you can be on in high school, I think you should be on. The question is so that has to be, I think, a part of your philosophy. If it's not, you got to kind of wrestle with that. But how does the coach talk to the, because not everybody feels that way. And I'm probably looking at this from a biased lens. But I've seen baseball, and I'm not talking about our baseball coaches. They're fantastic. But I have seen baseball at times be guilty of this. I've seen a lot of other sports be guilty of this, monopolizing the kids' time more so than football. Because you can't play football year-round. You can play baseball all year round in this state. And there's a lot of things you can do. So how does a coach talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, and I think that's the hardest part in these interview questions, right? Because a coach could talk a lot and say a lot of the right things, and it's show me how you've done this, right? Like, is there a way? Or when you talk about it, I was a baseball coach. I was lucky enough. I got to be a head baseball coach for a little bit of my life, and I think that philosophy starts at the top from your athletic director, and then does your athletic director build opportunities for your coaches to get to know each other, right? Because I think that's where I think some of that monopolization starts to happen is coaches don't trust each other to, hey, I'm going to let my stud point guard play a little football knowing that, oh my gosh, what could possibly happen to him, right? But because there's trust in those relationships and your athletics department, does that, there's trust that you're going to do whatever you can to help protect that kid, right? And that, stems back to the culture of the athletic department. And I think being able to talk to the committee about how you've built those relationships across sports, right? And I think what goes a long way in that is having coaches at different levels in different sports, right? You talked about hiring Traston as a freshman football coach. He was your head wrestling coach, right? Where he's able to build good relationships with kids, get them tougher in the wrestling room. And that's a system that works, right? And I think that's kind of how you talk about that as a coach, right? How am I going to develop a staff? I'm just not going to have a staff full of, my guys that I'm going to bring on, right? I'm going to talk to our coaching staff. I'm going to talk to the guys that are in the room already and in the school already, and try to you build that across seasons, because then kids feel more confident in those coaches, right? Like I trust Coach Yates in football. I trust him in wrestling. I trust Coach Collette in this, right? Like, and that's again how you talk about that, right? Like not just I'm a football coach, I'm an athletic coach, right? The movements that I teach not only help in football, but they help in this and they help in that. And we're going to do what we can, right? So I think that's a way to talk about it and to show it. And it's also, right, like when you hear names of other coaches, like that gives that committee, again, oh, they mentioned this person, right? Coaching World Small, give them a call, right? Oh, they do they do push this. But talking about baseball, right? I think that's the culture of baseball right now. I don't think that's coaches, and I think that's becoming the culture in a lot of our club sports is you have to play this sport all the time. And I think that's where us in educational athletics, we have to fight against that wave, right? We have to find offerings for our kids when they're wearing, the Prescott P or the Arcadia A, right? Give them those opportunities in the summer to where they're not going to these clubs and being told, hey, you got to play baseball all the time. No, there's a chance for you to do football in the mornings and go play your baseball game in the afternoon. And that's where, again, that relationship with coaches, like, hey, I understand you got a game tonight. We're not going to have, if it's a leg day, we're not going to have them do legs. I get that, right? That's where, again, that relationship with coaches comes from. And I think as young coaches, right, we want to kind of, I'll say, hoard our best players. But we know that if a kid plays multiple sports, their body's working in different ways, the chances of them getting hurt are way less. The data supports that. And that's, again, another having good relationships with your athletic trainer, having good relationships with your strength staff at your school, and those type of things. So, that's kind of how I would say somebody talk about that is give concrete examples of like how you've shown your kids that you do believe in multi-sport athletes. And then again, right, as the AD, if that's an expectation of me, I got to be the one pushing that. Ask the questions. Hey, why didn't this kid wrestle? Did anybody talk to him about wrestling? And then also have those conversations with the kids, right? Like, I still walk the halls every day and sit out in the courtyard. And if I see a 6'3" guy, why aren't you playing football? Why aren't you playing basketball? Why aren't you doing these things? And start like that. So
I think that's all really, really valuable information. I've been fortunate. I have a couple different little weight room certifications, and I've lifted girls basketball, not here, but at other places. I've done a couple things with our team. I've lifted tennis, not exactly some sports you often hear the football coach being involved with, but I think that's been really fun. I get to announce for boys and girls basketball, which is a lot of fun. But moving on to the next question that I wanted to talk about is resource-wise. Now, obviously, different schools have different resources in terms of what's in place. But what is it appropriate for a coach to be able to ask for? I mean, this isn't Texas. He's not going to be able to bring his whole staff. But if there's an opening, is he allowed to be like, hey, I really want to get this guy on. Can we look at doing that? There's times I've done that, and it's worked out great. It's happened. There's times I've done that. It hasn't worked out. They didn't hire that person for admin, and I understand that they're trying to hire the best teacher possible. But in my experience, most coaches are pretty decent in the classroom, which I know some people might not agree with, but I very much have seen that. So yep. What is it appropriate for the coach to ask in that interview process?
Yeah, I think it's – and again, I'll go back to – as an AD, I want as many coaches on my campus as I possibly can. But I think it's appropriate if you have, 2 or 3 kind of core coaches that you're bringing over from one staff to the other. I think you could totally ask those questions and be like, hey, what's available? Also, though, be prepared for the AD to come back and be like, hey, we don't have those roles right now. But if we do get those roles, we definitely, in our kind of matrix, I say that's a check mark that normally gets them an interview, right? And then from there, the interview will play out how it plays out. But that's also the AD talking to the principal, being like, hey, we need X amount of coaches on campus for us. But I think in the interview process, that's a good time for the coach to kind of interview the school, right? Is the school going to do everything it can to turn around the program, right? Because 9 times out of 10, the reason why a school is interviewing for a coach is there's been lack of success, right? And so there, is the school really invested in turning that program around? And part of that is, getting coaches on campus that interact and get the kids and can hold the kids accountable, right? Because if you have an all-campus or an off-campus staff and those kids are not pulling their weight in the classroom or on the campus, That's not turning the culture. So I think that's a really great opportunity for the coach to interview the AD and that committee on what is their commitment, right? Because I believe interviewing is like dating, you know. And if you're in that interview and your red flags are popping up, like, no, we're not going to bring anybody on campus. Ooh, how hard is that going to be for me as a young coach or a coach trying to come into this situation? That's going to be tough for me to make the changes that you want to see. So why would I, handcuff myself in taking that role, right? Do I just want to be a head coach, or do I want to be a head coach that's going to make impactful changes for the long run?
I think that's all very valuable vision. I've talked about this before. When you're trying to become a head coach and there's guys that they'll just want to be anywhere, you got to make sure that it's the right fit. I enjoyed my time at Post and Butte. I didn't feel like I was the right fit. I feel like I'm a better fit at Prescott. I think that's important for the coach and the school, for the coach to be the right fit at each school, and incredibly important for the coach and AD, their vision to align. If their vision doesn't align, you're setting yourself up for not a successful situation. A couple little questions that are a little bit different here, and you talked about it a little bit, wanting to have coaches on campus. And maybe you've seen it different. I remember, and I was in school in the 90s, my whole staff was on campus.
Yeah.
I had a football coach in every building, in science, in history, in this. And that was, in a lot of cases, assistant basketball coaches were on campus. Baseball, all these things. There were so many teachers that were coaches. What legitimately has led to, in my view, the decline? Because now,
100%.
dramatically less. I sit there in the teaching room sometimes in meetings, and I go, "There's like 6 coaches. There's 90 people in here, and 6 of them are coaching."
Yeah.
What do you think has led to the decline?
So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Like, and you've known this, right? You've been a teacher, you've been a coach for a long time. Is the amount of time required, right? And then the amount of pay that doesn't come with that required time, right? To be successful, you need kids in the off season, in the summer, and those things. And I think districts are working on ways to try to find ways to compensate coaches, but it's still, you're spending more time with a lot of these kids than potentially they're getting at home with mom and dad. And we don't want to just say you're working for free as coaches, right? So coaches, and teachers I'm spending more time with these kids than I am at home. I'm not getting compensated. I'm not getting this. So I'm just going to turn that time into time with my kids and my own family, right? I think that's a big piece to it. I also think that we are losing really great teachers and coaches because of the lack of support that we're seeing in our state, right? When teachers aren't seeing, pay increases that keep up with inflation or life change, those type of things, right? At the end of the day, teachers are still people, coaches are still people, and a lot of them have families, and they're going to go find a way to support their family the best they can. So if we're not going to reward them with compensated time or whatever it is, they're going to start looking. So I think we're just seeing good teachers leave the profession that are also good coaches because we're not able to make it attractive enough for them. And that's bigger than a school, right? That's bigger than a district. That's stuff that we got to figure out and take care of, not only at our state level, but our national level. Because what our teachers and coaches do is I think you're seeing a direct correlation with what's going on in society, right? Like, we don't have enough of those good people doing that. And you're seeing some societal things that are just different than they were 20 years ago, right? Like when I talk about, when I talk about Michael Spencer, right? That guy was a math teacher. He was in there. He was doing great things, and he is still doing those great things. But you're seeing less and less of those, and it's because we don't take care of them.
Coach, that's we're getting into some heavy waters here, but I think it's important conversation. I really do. I think,
Yeah.
and that is not like you alluded to. That's not a school issue. That's not a state issue. I've seen that everywhere. And I'm talking to a
Yeah.
guy on the podcast from Texas in a couple of days, and I'm really excited to, because as you know, or maybe you don't know, Texas, you have to be on a part of the school district to be a coach, which is an interesting. How do they, I'm dying. How do they do that? Because that wouldn't be. You would have teams just fold up in Arizona, I think, if you had to do that way. And I'm going to go a little different. I think some of it is the pay for coaches. I think some of it is, and I'm not blaming anybody again for this, but there is more and more and more and more and more on the teacher's plate that
Yeah.
go, I have so much to do in my teaching job now that they've added that I can't do the coaching part too, because it's like two full-time jobs. It really
Yep.
is. So
I don't disagree with you.
yeah, I think there's some issue there. Now, next question, and this is like blown some guys away. But so before I ask this, I want to preface this. One of my greatest, not accomplishments, but the thing I enjoy the most is I've been able to attend a number of players' weddings. My our current defensive coordinator is a former player. I just did a podcast with a guy that I had the honor to coach that's a DC now. Number of guys I've coached with have gone into coaching, and I'm not saying that to pat myself in the back. I'm just saying I value those relationships. They mean a lot to me. That said, since I've been in education in 22, 23 years, all we have said is relationship, 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 relationship. Have we set kids up for failure when they go to their boss? And quite frankly, he doesn't care if they're buddies. He wants them to do the job. So I know that's different than everything and I'm not. So please, I hope you don't hear that I'm saying relationships aren't important. But does there have to be a balance? Because to me, it's been all that for 25 years, and I don't know that it's led to better results.
Can we add a preface to your relationship? Can we say honest relationships?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? Because I think if you're having honest relationships with your players, your coaches, that does set them up for those conversations that they will have with their bosses that could be friends, right? If I'm having an honest relationship with my stud middle linebacker, hey, you're not getting there. You're not doing the job, right? That's building accountability and toughness. Now, you're not doing the job yet. We're going to get you, or we're going to put you in a situation where you can do the job. Then that leads to when he's 25 years old, boss is saying, hey, you can't do the job. Well, that's something that he's able to internalize a little bit better. And then he can, well, what can I do to get to a position where I can do a job or do different job, right? And I think those are, because I agree with you, right? It's about relationships. It's about relationship. Well, it is, but it's about honest relationships, right? I'm not going to put a kid, that can't do a job into a situation that is one, at the end of the day, going to embarrass him, right? The thing that I think of is, remember the Titans and the player who couldn't cover the wide receiver. As a coach, yeah, there you go. Yes, right. Why am I, as a coach, going to keep putting that kid in there? Well, probably because I have a relationship with him, but not an honest relationship, right? Those are two completely different things. I'll continue. I believe in you. I believe in you. I do believe in you. That's why I think you shouldn't be playing corner. You should be playing outside linebacker or D end or whatever, right? I believe in you, but maybe you shouldn't be playing wide receiver. Maybe you should be playing slot or, all these different things, right? You shouldn't be the tight end. You should be the left tackle. I know you want to catch the ball, but here in 2 years, man, when you get to college and they put 45 pounds on you, you're going to be a left tackle. And having those honest, and then it comes down to those with your bosses and your kids and all those different things. So I think it is about relationships, but honest relationships.
I think as I've gotten older, I've been able to have those conversations more because that's gold right there, is the honest relationships part. I've talked to kids, been like, hey, I think you're an all-region linebacker. You're not our quarterback. I don't think you're our quarterback. It's not that I'm giving up on you. I think you're a really good football player. You're not our quarterback. I can let you keep practicing there, but it's not doing us any good. So I want you to be in a place where you can be successful. And I think what you said there, honest relationships, is something that is critical for coaches, and it's probably the best answer I've heard on that question, because I've asked that question a few times to people, and that is one of the better answers, if not the best one I've heard there. So moving on to a couple little things here, and you alluded to it a little bit here, but should the coach give a follow-up call after the interview? During the interview, what are things that they can do to set themselves apart, and what are they doing in that mode where, because I've heard of coaches have situations where they didn't find out that they didn't get hired until they saw the paper and saw that. What can they ask? What can they expect from the AD in that regard?
Yeah, so I always believe, even when I interview for jobs, I always send that's one of the notes that I take down, is everybody's name kind of in that room. And I send them an email, just, hey, thank you for the time. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. Because a lot of times, it's a teacher, it's other coaches. It might be missing some class time or practice time, or even when the principals are off their normal routine, right? Those are valuable moments that they're not using with their campus. So I always send a personal email to each person on the committee. And I think that just goes a long way to showing, like, hey, I really value it. Hopefully the committee says, hey, this is when we're going to get back to you. And then if they don't, right, I'll come back to saying, then you probably didn't want to work for them anyways, right? If they're not willing to follow through on what they said, right? Like, and sometimes it might be, hey, we're going to get back to you in an email, or, hey, if, we're going to make a choice on second rounds on this day. If you don't hear from us, that means you weren't chosen, right? There's all sorts of kind of different ways that committees do that. But, I think a lot of times if you don't hear anything, I think that's one of the biggest gripes, I think, with kind of my profession now as an athletic director is, we don't always communicate the best, right? And I think we're all trying to work on it. But I think it's really important that puts you again at another level, is when you send that follow-up. And then even I really appreciate, because one of my goals as an athletic director is to help coaches still, regardless if you're one of my coaches or not. Even after you might not have gotten the job, if you want to hear about maybe areas that you can work on, or that, I think would be really good in your interview, I'm willing to give feedback to those coaches, right? Because I've been the young coach that has gotten the no, and it sucks. It is one of the worst feelings ever, especially if you come in feeling like you're prepared and you hit a home run, right? So I always like to give those feedback, everybody opportunity for feedback. And, that sending that follow-up email always allows for me to reach back out and be like, hey, we might not have gone with you, but I'd love to sit down, or if you have questions, I'd love to give you, some information.
Coach, another great answer. Really enjoyed that. And I've been on that. I've been on the receiving end of that more often than not. Chances are you're not going to get the job. You got to be willing to put yourself out there for failure, and that happens sometimes. And I tell her that's one of the most important life lessons in sports. And I tell our kids this all the time, because I think there's a defense mechanism that kids will have. There's times you go as hard as you possibly can, and you worked as hard as you possibly can, and you lose. That still happens. And learning how to adjust to that, I think, is critical for everybody's development. But last question, and I've talked about this a little bit here. Education is kind of one of the few professions where it's almost assumed if you leave a district, you're going to give up a certain amount of salary. Is that okay for a coach to talk about in the interview? And we've talked about some ways we're trying to alleviate that. But there's certain situations that I've seen districts make something happen, and certain situations where they haven't. Is that something a coach should be able to ask? Because I know my uncle has thought about becoming a head coach again, but he's been in the Tempe district for almost 30 years. He can't go get a fourth-year teacher salary and do that. So is that okay for a coach to ask?
I always think it is, but I also, I'll tell a coach, be prepared for, like, no, we can't do that, right? Like, and that's where I'd say as coaches, right, when you go to hire or apply for a job, look at the salaries. Now most of the days now, every coaching stipend and every salary is posted, right? In some capacity. So I'd go look at that, and be prepared to, sometimes I would think, we can go to HR and be like, hey, this coach has this amount of experience. Can we move him to this step, or can we do that? And then I also got to be prepared for no as well, right? But that's also, go goes a long way in showing the coach that we support him and that we're doing everything we can to get him in the door. And at the end of the day, if that really is a crux for them, I get that. They got to be supporters of their family, and that's that.
All right, last question, and I think this is critical in aligning the vision of coach and AD, but talk a little bit about football within the school community, because this is the second time I've heard this, football coach like an administrators. There's some that don't feel that way. I think if you're a football coach and you hear that from the AD that is interviewing you, this is probably a place that's going to be supportive of you when they talk about you in that high regard. But talk about football within the school community and matching and aligning those visions.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look at, if we, look at the top teams in our state, you think of the Liberties, the Bashes, the Hamiltons, the Centennials, all even at the 4A level, Prescott, we look to you guys. You're one of them. When we look at the playoffs, when we look at that, you guys are always in the mix, right? When we look at those teams, their football team sets the standard for that school, right? You don't hear anybody talk about how bad Liberty High School is. You don't hear people talk about how bad Prescott High School is. You don't hear those things, right? You hear, oh, Liberty's so great. Bash is so great, because the football team, everybody says it, right? But they kick off the school year. If your football team is doing well, most of the time, your school culture is a positive school culture, right? Because everybody wants to go to Friday Night Lights. Everybody wants to be a part of that. The band, the cheer and pom teams, all those different things, the community, those type of things. So it is, to me, football is, out of 9 out of 10 schools, is the sport that is the catalyst for everything that you're doing, right? And that is just so important. And giving your coach the ability to, I'll say, enjoy that is really important, right? And enjoy the fruits of your labor and talk about that. As good leaders, I think, for me, when our teams are doing well, it's the coaches, it's the kids, right? They are the ones who are being the leaders. They're the ones who deserve that credit. I say this all the time. If nobody knew that I was the athletic director, I'd love my life. Because a lot of times, people, oh, you're the athletic director. Yeah, but it's about the kids. It's about the coaches. No, I'm just here as a support system for them. They get the praise, I get the hate. Is one thing that I've kind of tried to do in my years as administrator is I take on the tough stuff for them. But that it is the most important, I think, when we talk about culture. How is your football team doing? I would say at most schools, if your football team's culture is pretty good, your culture around campus is pretty good. And that's just because it's the largest, right? Like unfortunately that's the hate that also comes with football, right? Oh, you always get what you want. But you don't, right? You don't really always get what you want. You know what I mean? Like, and that's where, again, having that good coaching culture comes in. Is, football does not get everything. They get what they deserve. And luckily we have football, because if we don't, we can't offer the 10 other sports because of what football drives for us, so.
Coach, I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us. I threw some fastballs in there, and you nailed every one of them. I thought those were all great answers, and I really value your time. I know how valuable your time is. This will get released during the season, so hopefully everybody's season's going well out there. Or excuse me, these ones will be released towards the end of the season as we're approaching this coaching carousel there. So hopefully there's something that you can take out of this that'll help you in your pursuit as coaches out there. So we will see you next time for another edition of the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show. Thank you so much, Coach. Oh, I don't know when it stopped. Well, you can edit that out. There we go.